Hello, we are continuing our comparison of active versus passive phono stage design, and I'm using the example of the ear 834p and the Hagerman Cornet as active versus passive phono stages because of their similarities of their signal circuitry, the schematics they use. So they're using essentially the same number of stages, uh, the same vacuum tube for the first two stages, and they both use a cathode follower. And the cathode follower is slightly different for the two, and that I have discussed in the first part of this comparison. So now we are going to what's happening between the first and the second tube stages, because at the first stage that was where we left off. So here with the ear you find that there is a coupling capacitor coupling the first stage to the second stage. So basically what we have here is a 0.15 microfarad capacitor and a 2 mega ohm grid leak resistor. So basically this forms an RC network for us, and this stage behaves as a voltage amplifier. So the second tube gets a higher voltage signal, and there's no RIA correction done in this part. However, we will have a feedback loop coming from here, so that will be part of the RIA network, but we are not there yet. I will talk about that loop a little bit later. You just have to wait in suspense for a while. So basically, for the ear, for the active circuitry, we have an active first stage, and the signal goes without attenuation to the second stage. And what do we have with the passive RIA? Here we have the equalization network, the RIA network between the first tube and the second tube. So basically, we have a roughly 50 times increase in the voltage that comes in from your cartridge, because the gain, the mu of the 12AX7 is about 100. Now if we are using unbypassed cathode, then we divide it by 2. So roughly we get something like around 50. So if you had a 5 millivolt input, then you get 250 millivolt output. And now that 200 millivolt output goes through this filter, and you see there's first a 10 kilo ohm resistor, and then a series of networks going there. There's a capacitor in the signal path, and then the grid stopper, and then the second stage. And the second stage is an active stage again. So the job was done by the passive network, and there's another active stage, again providing a gain of 50 to the voltage, and then it goes to the cathode follower tube, which provides a low output impedance. And then there's a capacitor, that's the coupling capacitor that decouples the DC, and then you can enjoy a nice low Z output. And the purpose of the cathode follower for both phono stage designs is to give low output impedance. And why is that? Because it is required to drive long interconnect cables or difficult or junk interconnect cables. So for example, if you happen to know people who don't believe in interconnect cables, their faith will be left relatively intact when your phono stage has a cathode follower. Now, if you take away this cathode follower and you leave this coupling capacitor here, right there after the second tube, then the faith of these people will be severely tested, because depending on the interconnect, the sound coming from the phono stage will be dramatically different. Also, if you have a vintage tube amplifier, then it will sound pretty decent without a cathode follower and using a high quality interconnect. But if you connect a modern solid state amplifier with a low input impedance, let's say 50 kilo ohm or maybe even less, and if you don't have a cathode follower, plus you are using some junk interconnect, you will have absolutely zero bass coming out from the unit. And that's not because the circuit is junk, but because you have no clue how to use it. So for those people, Jim and the designer of the year have added the cathode follower stage. And yes, that's an extra stage. It adds extra potential problems, but in real life, with most systems, it provides much more advantages compared to detractions. So I can recommend, because I have experimented with this a lot, that you can omit the cathode follower here if you keep the phono stage in an integrated amplifier. So there's no long interconnects, but you are driving your input selector switch, and then here's the grid of your input tube of your power amplifier right after that. So if there's just like few centimeters of wire, then you'll be okay to drive it, okay-ish. But even then, you might benefit from a cathode follower, but you can get by without it, depending on the application. However, for a standalone unit, the cathode follower is almost always mandatory. So now let's have a look at this part, the EQ network, because that's the difference between an active and a passive phono stage. So this is a passive phono stage, the cornet, and it's called a passive because there is a signal, and that signal is passively transformed, passively equalized. So it means that we are receiving a signal here from the plate of the first stage, and depending on the frequencies, it's going to get cut by different degrees. So if it's a low frequency signal, let's say 20 Hertz, it's not getting virtually any cut at all. But if it's a high tone, let's say around 20 kilohertz, then it will get vast cut from its level. And then we get the original music restored that we can enjoy as normal music. And the process that generates is resistors and capacitors. And that's an inferior choice compared to active, because we are losing voltage and current through these resistors, and the capacitors are coloring the sound. So what is critical here is the quality of these resistors and capacitors. And this was a huge issue 20 years ago. Oh, and I have another issue. My battery is low, so I have to stop making this video again if I don't want to lose it. So we'll continue from here. Have a wonderful day. Bye-bye. Szerintem lehet, hogy most ennyi elég is, nem?
Vámos vagyok.
Vámos ottan.
Hát igen.
Viszont elfelejtem, hogy hol voltam, vagy nem felejtem el? Lehet, hogy most abba vagyom én is, nem? Jó, ennyi volt. Ja, nem is tudom folytatni, mert lemerült a batteri, bakker. Hogy folytattam? Ha nem? Le kell dugni utána.